Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Books and Books. I want to welcome you all. I'm Mitchell Kaplan. On behalf of all of us here at the bookstore, I just want to say thanks for coming out on this rainy night in Miami. We had such great weather, didn't we, the last few days? I also want to tell you that we also do things periodically on the internet, and we're live streaming this event. So I know you're going to love it. So when you go home, you can watch it all over again as well, if you'd like. And if you take a second and you want to tweet it out to any of your friends or send an email out to anybody in China or Brazil or anywhere else so they can watch it tonight, we would like that as well. But we do that periodically, and you can go to booksandbooks.com, and you can even see an archive of older events that we've had here at the store as well. The other thing I have to say is when I stand up here, I cannot ever in October tell you not to go to the Miami Book Fair. Or I can never say that, I can never not stand, I can't even say this thing. I can't, what am I trying to say? I am telling you to go to the Miami Book Fair in November. It's November 16th through 23rd. We'd love to see you there, and we have a great lineup this year as well. The Swamp. We will tell you that on November 2nd. We're having a discussion about the Miami Book Fair. But the Swamp is a tent where you can see events having to do with Florida subjects. Everything from music to books to photos to other things. So that's what the Swamp is. We got a grant from the Knight Foundation to do that as well. But tonight's tonight, and tonight it's really a pleasure for me personally to welcome a friend, someone that I've known for a lot of years, who's a marvelous writer. His name is William Gordon, and he's written now, this is your 10th novel? 5th, I'm sorry. Well, because of the translations, I think of it as 10. He's written 5 novels that's been translated into something like 15 languages, 10 languages or so, and they're really pretty remarkable. And he started off his career as a trial lawyer in San Francisco, where he lives now with his wife, the novelist, who I'm sure all of you have heard of, is Isabel Allende. And Willie is a marvelous writer in his own right, and we are so happy to have him here in Miami. And so I hope you give him a warm, warm Books and Books welcome. William Gordon.
Thank you very much. I'm going to read you from this book in a moment, but I thought I'd introduce myself. I was a trial lawyer for many years. I still am a lawyer. And my father was quite a character. He invented a religion. It was called the Infinite Plan. And he died when I was 6 years old, but he was a writer. And he wrote a book called The Infinite Plan. And when I got together with Isabel Allende, she wanted to write a story about me for some reason. And so I took her all over the places that my father wandered in the Southwest, pitching his tent and giving this speech. And I used to watch him all up until the time almost that he died, which was in 1943. And so he, when he died, his assistant, who was a Mexican woman who handled the money, she was probably his lover, from a little that I understood of those things in those days. And I hated her. And and I always knew I was going to be a writer then, but I knew I was going to be 60 years old before I started. And don't ask me why I picked 60, but that's what it was. So when I got together with Isabel Allende, I was now then 50 years old. And so we started talking back and forth, and she would tell me about the scenes of her books, and I would listen, and I would tell her she could do this and she couldn't do that. And she said that, who was I to tell her what to write? And I said, well, I want to tell you why. I said, because I was a lawyer, and in my days as a lawyer, I would take care of people who were Mexican. They didn't speak English, they spoke Spanish. So I would say to them, tell me the story, what happened? So they would tell me X, Y, Z, I did this, I did that, and I said, well, if that's the way it happened, I just can't help you. But I said, if it happened this way, and then I would tell them what I saw was a feasible cause of action, and then they say, okay. So then they would come back the next day and they say, ay, senor, it happened just the way you said it did. So I would say, okay, well, now I can represent you. And so anyway, so I said, that's why I can tell you, Isabel, that you're full of crap. You're not doing it right, and if you do it this way, then people will believe it. So anyway, so I learned that she had this quality of visual realization, and I actually had it too. And so I thought, well, maybe I've got some. Maybe I can fulfill this dream that I've always had. So I sat down when I was 60 years old, and I started to write. And I wrote a 700-page book. The principal character of which was an oversexed dwarf. And my wife read this book, and she said, this is disgusting. This guy, no woman in their right mind would ever want to sleep with this guy, so what are you doing? And she said, why don't you write mystery stories, because you're a lawyer and you like to study forensics by yourself. So I said, okay. So I started writing mystery stories, and I wrote The Chinese Jars, and then I wrote The King of the Bottom, and I finally got down to this one. But the third book I wrote was The Ugly Dwarf. And the dwarf came back. And why did the dwarf come back? Well, the dwarf came back because when I thought about my father as I was growing older, I realized that emotionally he was a dwarf. He was a womanizer, he was a drunk, and he died when he was 51 years old in 1943. And this Mexican woman who was his associate and his lover took us under her wing, and she gave us an apartment to live in East Los Angeles, which was a Mexican neighborhood, because that's where she could own property, and she collected the rent from the county of Los Angeles. So she was a chiseler and a bitch and all that stuff, and then finally she went to jail as a black magic purveyor. And so when I wrote this book, The Ugly Dwarf, I have a dominatrix in there, and the dominatrix I gave was the helper to the guy, the dwarf, who invented the religion. And so then when the book was over and the people started reading it, then they came up and they said, oh, the witch was just fantastic. And I said, no, she couldn't be fantastic. I made her a bitch because I hated her. And they said, well, you did a great job because we love her. So that's the story of the dwarf. And actually, the dwarf was actually going to be here this evening, but he's got 3 old ladies from Argentina with him, and he hasn't arrived yet because he probably got lost in Miami. But he'll be here, and when he walks in here, the big, tall guy limping is the dwarf. So you'll just know that. And the reason that he's limping is because he used to get on his knees a lot. And I'm not going to touch that. Anyway, so then after the dwarf, I wrote another book that's very controversial called The Fractured Lives, which is a story about a Palestinian that's murdered in San Francisco, and the question is always, who done it? And of course, to find that out, you have to read the book. Now, this book is a story of the halls of power, just like it sounds. And I'm going to read you a few pages from the first chapter, because the rule for mystery writers, as far as I'm concerned, is that if you don't have a murder in the first few pages, then you lose the audience. And so if you read my books, you'll always find out that the dead body appears right away, and the why happens later. I mean, that's the idea. So the second element is suspense. You got to have suspense. Dead body and suspense. The characters, I just want to say a little bit about, are the same in all of them. And if you're really interested in my work, the first book is called The Chinese Jars, and that's the one you should read sooner or later, because that has the beginnings of Samuel Hamilton, the reporter, and Melba Sundling is the owner of the bar. Now, Melba Sundling is a very wholesome character, and she has a whiskey voice because she drinks a lot of whiskey and smokes a lot and everything, but she's a real person. I had a bar with her for 25 years, so I didn't have to touch hair on her head. And the idea is that these mysteries take place in the 60s in San Francisco. And the reason I wanted that to happen was because I didn't want to mess around with mobile phones, faxes, DNA, or anything else. I wanted these my detectives to do exactly what they did in the old days. They just had to pound the pavement to find out who did what. So that's how it goes. And I also didn't want a macho detective. I wanted a guy who was kind of lost in the beginning, and as the books went along, then he would find himself and become, I wouldn't say a better person, but a better detective. Okay, so here we go. This is called Chapter 1. It's the accident of the Halls of Power. It was late September 1963 and a busy morning at Conklin Chemical. The air was crisp and the sky, by the way, Chad Conklin, the guy here, he's really an asshole, believe me. And I painted him as such. In his office, Chad Conklin, the owner of the company, whistled cheerfully as he went over the delivery schedule with Sambaguita Poliscarpio. That's a Filipino guy who's his Filipino director of operations. At 6'2", the trim and suntan Conklin towered over his diminutive employee. They looked out the window of the company's building located on the south of Market neighborhood, just off 3rd Street, onto the sparkling San Francisco Bay. We need to get this big holding tank cleaned out, and we have to hurry because they're bringing the bulk chemicals in at noon, Conklin told Sambaguita. We have to mix and have the shipment ready by the day after tomorrow. Sambaguita shook his head. I don't think we can get that done that quick, Chief. There was a pretty nasty mixture in the big holding tank that left a lot of sludge that will have to be scooped out. We'll need to tilt the tank on its side before we can get the machine in there, and with an arm long enough to do the job, and we'll have to use the crane to tilt the tank. No, replied Conklin. Send a man in there with a basket from a crane, and he can fill the buckets with the sludge in just a couple of hours. I don't know, Chief. That's pretty toxic stuff. I don't think a man can do it by himself. God damn it! Then send in 2 men with buckets instead of just 1. Conklin laughed and turned away, shifting his attention to what else they need to get ready for the big delivery that was due at noon. Still shaking his head, Sambaguita went out into the yard and sized up the 15-foot-high mixing tank. He went over to the crane operator and told him, "Lift me up to the basket so I can take a look at the tank." The operator lowered the basket, and Sambaguita climbed in and was hoisted to the top of the tank. He shined his power light into the 4-foot opening and saw 2 feet of sludge at the bottom. As he sat in the basket, he calculated that it would take 2 men filling 10 buckets and each scoop to scoop enough of the material out of the tank so it could be washed and drained. At the same time, he got a whiff of the noxious odor of the sludge. After 10 seconds, the vapors made him so dizzy that he grew even more worried about the safety of his men. "Okay, bring me down," he ordered. When the basket was back on the ground, he went quickly back to the office. Conklin was busy with the bookkeeper, but Sambaguita interrupted them. "It's too dangerous to send them down there. The fumes will kill them." Conklin stood up to his full height and looked down at Sambaguita. "God damn it, SP, I gave you an order. I want that tank ready by noon. Now get your ass out there and put 2 men in the tank. And I don't mean 2 jerk-offs. I put the best men we have in there to get the job done right. I'm telling you, Chief, it's a bad situation. There's no ventilation." "Bullshit," Conklin fumed. "I'll take responsibility for that." He stomped out into the yard. "Sanchez, come over here." Roberto Sanchez, an illegal immigrant from Jalisco, Mexico, he was short and slim with angular Indian cheekbones and intelligent brown eyes, was a whiz of a mechanic. He kept Conklin Chemical complicated machinery humming, sometimes with baling wire and tape. He stopped cleaning the hoses to a chemical tank and complied, coming to the stand directly in front of Conklin. He too was small compared to the boss. Conklin looked down into his handsome face. You see that tank over there? Take one man and go in there with that bucket and clean it out by noon. Comprende, amigo? Sí, señor, I understand, said Roberto, who had listened carefully. He was always very careful to listen to his boss and to comply with his wishes because his job was important to him and his family. Conklin turned back to his director of operations. Policarpio, get 2 ventilator masks from the tool shed. Sambaguita went into the shed and made a quick study of the masks in the company's inventory, which were lined up against one of the walls. There were only 5 for the 15 employees, and none of them had ever been used. Each had a rounded plastic enclosure with a leather strap that fit on the head of the worker. Attached to the plastic was a hose that led to a scuba diver-like tank that had shoulder straps so he could be carried on the worker's back. He glanced at the expiration dates on the oxygen tanks and saw that they all had long passed their use-by dates. He walked out into the shed and yelled to Conklin, "The air is dead in all of these." "Let me see," Conklin demanded, running over. He took one of the masks and put it over his face, turning on the oxygen. It hissed, so he decided it was functional. "No need to worry, SP. I know from my Navy experience that these things last forever." He handed 2 masks to Roberto, who was by that time called his cousin Carlos Sanchez over to help him. You can put them on in the tank. "Sí, señor," replied Roberto and Carlos. They made their way to the bucket of the crane with their equipment. They put on the rubber boots and gloves and stacked several sludge buckets on one side, on the inside on another, and climbed into the basket, which was about 3 feet deep. The crane operator lifted them up to the top of the tank. They stood in the middle of the basket, holding on to the cable. When it reached the opening of the tank, which was about 4 feet in diameter, Carlos signaled the crane operator to center it over the opening. Roberto and Carlos put on the respirator masks and were slowly lowered to the bottom of the tank. They looked at each other anxiously as they got out of and began scooping the gunk into the sludge buckets with their shovels. The respirator masks were too tight to allow speech, but Carlos, in between his shoveling, kept pointing to his as if in distress. When full, each bucket was placed inside the bucket by one of the 2 workers. Basket instead of bucket. Then Carlos pulled the cord and it was slowly lifted out of the tank, emptied of its cargo, and returned to them. Carlos motioned to Roberto that they should work faster so that they could get out of there. When they were filling the basket with the buckets for the second time, when Carlos keeled over, Roberto grabbed at him, but he couldn't keep him from falling, face down in the sludge. Roberto pulled him out of the sludge and yanked at the cord. The crane operator, thinking that the load was ready, hoisted the basket out of the tank only to find it empty. Frantically, Roberto continued yanking on the line while trying to hold Carlos up out of the sludge. When Sambaguita saw the basket come down to the top empty, he registered the confused look on the crane operator's face. He realized there was a problem. "Get me up there, fast," he said. He yelled to the operator. The operator quickly swung the basket down to the ground. Sambaguita grabbed the mask and motioned for the operator to lift him up to the top. Before covering his mouth and nose with the ventilator mask, he yelled to a worker, "Call an ambulance and get the fire department. Tell them it's an emergency." Then he ordered the crane driver to lower him into the tank. Once inside, he saw Roberto struggling to hold Carlos's limp, sludge-covered body out of the muck. When Sambaguita reached the bottom of the tank, he grabbed at Carlos and tried to lift him, but his limp forms slipped from his hands. He was finally able to grab Carlos by the arms, even though his jacket was slimy and with sludge, and with the help of Roberto threw the unconscious man over his shoulder. He then lowered Carlos into the basket, wedging his butt on the bottom with his arms and legs sticking up in the air. Sambaguita pulled on the cord, but at that instant his respirator tank failed and he inhaled the toxic fumes. He fainted, falling into a seated position back into the sludge. Well, you get the idea. It's murder. So the question is, what happens? And this isn't the only murder. This is only the beginning. So actually, I'd like to just talk to you. If you have questions, I'll answer as many as I can, and the ones I can't answer, I'll make up. So, shoot.
Willie, who are some of the noir writers that you always admired?
Well, believe it or not, the most important writer that I admire is William Somerset Maugham. And the reason for that is, if you read his short stories, which I'm sure some people have, at the end, there's always a twist. And in each one of these libros, there are a lot of twists. And that's where I got it from him. Raymond Chandler, Dashiell Hammett. I love the guys in the noir period. And that's another reason why I went back to that when I started writing, because I admired them very much. And I don't know if anybody remembers Ellery Queen, but Ellery Queen was not actually a person. It was two guys who created a detective book, and they used to write these detective stories. So I used to read them all the time. I loved them. And even Mickey Spillane, God rest his soul, he was a character, and he was a good writer for that type of book. So that's where I go back to my noir writers, and of course, and then you have the great Sherlock Holmes and all those guys, and even Chaucer. Yeah.
That's a very colorful beginning, and I want to know if you ever watched anything like that. How did you get so much detail?
Well, believe it or not, I'm a lawyer. This is based on a case that I handled. Yeah, so I read the reports and I took down the information, and of course there's a wonderful thing about when you write a book, you win. And I actually lost the case because he was an employee, and I got kicked out of court. But I got kicked out of court a lot, 50 years, So, but that's how I got the story. I mean, that's where and of course I invented a lot of stuff. Like Sambaghita Pulascarpio, I invented that guy. And I also invented Chad Conklin, but I used to watch the athletes run around Berkeley, where I went to school, and all the big football players, I was just a skinny little kid, so you got to get even with them somehow. You portray them as evil in the books. That's an actual case.
In San Francisco?
San Francisco, yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
I'm curious, how long does it take to write a book of this?
Well, for me, it takes me a couple of years. I go along and I wait for stuff to happen to me, and I get inspiration from, just talking to people. I'm writing another book right now, and just 2 nights ago I got a great insight into a part of the book that I was stuck on. And so I don't like to hurry, because it really is a kind of an avocation with me, as opposed to a job. So I like to take my time, and I usually write by hand, or I used to. I pretty much do a computer now, but I'm here in Miami, and I left my computer home, so I'm writing half of a chapter by hand right now, on this very important point that I just figured out a couple of days ago.
I'm intrigued. Did the 700-pound book about the sexy dwarf ever get published?
Yes, that's the ugly dwarf. Yes.
Oh, so you took the
I
700
took-
pages and made it to the...
Well, here's what happened. I wrote this 700-page book, and then my wife told me it had to go in the trunk, and because she said every writer has a trunk book, and this is yours. And then she put her foot on the trunk, so I couldn't open it. And so then I started writing the books, and the Chinese jars didn't have any of the stories, but every one after that took something from my 700-page book. And so the third book about the ugly dwarf, that I took the story right from there. But because I realized by the time that I couldn't just let the dwarf go, that since this guy was emotionally my father, I had to get rid of him. I mean, I just had to get it out of my system. And then this book, this story was in my first book too. And so that part of the story, it changed a lot. And there's some other stuff. There's some other murders in here that take place. But I've used almost every. And this last book that I'm writing right now there's still a couple stories there. There's one about the South, because I noticed you had a Southern accent. But I haven't used that one yet. But I had a love story that was really, I don't know where this woman came from, but she just came to me, and so I wrote in her voice, and I just loved it. I always wanted to tell the story, and so when I got down to the book number 6, I started to write Emma, because that was the girl's name. She was a French artist, and so then I talked to my wife about it, as we talk over everything, and she told me that the love story wouldn't stand up by itself. I had to have a crime. So I had, in the original story, there's a lawyer from San Francisco who many people said it was me, but it wasn't me, because the guy used Italian suits and silk ties and Gucci shoes and all that stuff. And I used to have to hitchhike to court because I didn't have any money, and if I had any money, it would fall out of my pocket because I had holes in my pocket, because I represented the low guys on the totem pole. And so anyway, I said it wasn't me. It was me and the ideal, and they said, okay, we'll accept that. Tell us about who your lover was in France. And I said, no, you don't understand. When I went to France, I also went to France and I lived on $1 a day. So this was my fantasy about what it would be like to make love to a French girl. And so I said, okay. So you live in a fantasy world. I said, well, what the hell? I'm old enough to do that. So then last year my son died, my youngest son. And so then I started really getting into this story, this love story, and I realized that it wasn't a love story, it was a story about loss. And all her losses I had fictionalized into mine over the years, and so I've been working on that for over 1.5 years now. It's very hard and it's very painful, but it's kind of a way to sort of get it off my shoulders. And so that book's going to probably come out next year, and it's a lovely thing because it's it's a story about loss. It's not a story about love, because they kidnap her son, and then she comes. Samuel Hamilton, the hero. Well, you have to find out. I'm not going to tell you. Yes, sir.
But they're all set in San Francisco.
San Francisco.
Set in San Francisco, there's a kind of character.
Well, it really does have a character. I mean, people come up to me sometimes with tears in their eyes, say, God, I remember those days. And I say, thank God somebody else is old enough to remember the 60s in San Francisco, because I've been accused of being very visual in my description, so people get a pretty good idea about what San Francisco was like in the 60s. And that's the way I saw it then. It's not the way it is now, but it was, that's the way it was then. It's fantastic. So I know a lot about San Francisco just from being there, and from reading books and stuff, and looking at old pictures too. So I paint a pretty realistic picture of what it was like in the 60s, and I liked it then.
So I'm fascinated by this decision that you were going to start writing when you were 60.
Yeah.
Did you not write before that, or you just didn't start a book?
I didn't.
Didn't write at all?
Well, I wrote as a lawyer,
Yeah.
but I just knew I was going to do it. because my father was a writer. He wrote 3 books about mumbo jumbo. You know, if you do as I say and not as I do, I'll take you to heaven for a price. You know how those guys were. So they say that in those days Hollywood was the land of the fruits and the nuts, and he was one of the nuts. But they were from all. My father was Australian, and he was an artist and he invented this religion, which I'm telling you, I never read The Infinite Plan, but my wife used it as a story about me, and it's an international bestseller. So, what the hell? Here I am. You see the stars in my eyes? And and then when I was 50, I got together with Isabel, and so I said, this must be must be something. And so she helped me a lot, believe me. And I took her this 700-page manuscript first, and I said, there's something wrong with this. And she said, of course. I said, what is it? She said, 1,000 drafts. So, when you write, you have to, and so that's the other thing is that during the time that I would take these stories from the book that I'd written and I would transform them into the book that I was writing, I would change them and I would refine the language and everything. So that was the idea. I learned not 1,000 drafts, but certainly more than I cared to talk about here. Yeah.
Questions, and they're all related.
Well, that's okay.
I'm curious that you were not curious enough to read your dad's mumbo jumbo, because if he was a con artist,
Yeah.
that would be intriguing to see what ploy he used.
But I knew he was a con artist.
But don't you think there'd be a lot of revealing stuff in his own book and his own words?
Well, I'll tell you what I learned when I finally read it, which was shocking.
Oh, you did read it.
I did read it when I was writing The Ugly Dwarf, because I wanted to have the dwarf give a sermon that was like my father's. I found that it was fantastic because it was a work of fiction. And he was a good writer, a good fiction writer. And the whole thing was fiction. But it was a fiction, it was from his fertile mind. This guy was a genius. He was a really smart guy. And of course a mess. And so I actually had this really grudging admiration, because when I was a kid, I thought this is all bullshit, I mean, because listen, he would get people in the tent. It cost $1. This is in the Depression. And when they left the tent, they had to buy his book that cost $1. Now, geez, I mean, give me a break, But I mean, put the food on the table, and and then he was quite an enterprising guy, because if he couldn't get enough people into the tent at night, he would go to the post office and he would paint the murals in the post office. But they did that during the Depression. The artists, the WPA would give the artists work, and they would give them enough to eat and stuff like that. So I thought my dad was a pretty cool guy. And the fantastic thing that he showed me, aside from his thing, that he showed me freedom. You didn't have to have money, you just had to find a way to do it. So that's the kind of stuff I did. Like, I hitchhiked around the world on $1 a day. I was gone for a year. So that's the kind of stuff he gave me. That's the freedom he gave me.
That was part of my other question is, did you change, your feelings changed about him from your earlier experience, or did you get any insights? But it seems like you did.
Yeah, I always, well, this gets into pretty deep psychological stuff. Huh? Are you ready? Yeah. Prepared? Yeah. Well, my mother was a very absent person. She was also a very smart woman, which is kind of funny how I ended up in the ghetto, but that's part of the story. She was first in her class at Drexel University in 1920, one of the first women to graduate from, and she was the valedictorian. But she was I think she was autistic. So my father was the caretaker, and he was the one I was connected to. And in fact, the other night I had a dream about him, the first one since he died. He died in 1943, and I just dreamed about him. And he was tall, like I was. And then he was a very handsome guy. He had hair, and and he still had it when I saw him in the dream. And I said, "Geez, Dad, how are you getting along?" He was living in the Southwest, which he loved. And he said, "I'm doing great." And I said, "How old are you?" He says, "I'm 78." I said, "Oh, come on, you're bullshitting me." He says, "Well, you got to fib about something." And I says, "Where's my brother Daniel?" Because he had a child, Daniel, who was many, many years older than me. And I met him once. And he said, "Oh, he lives right down the street from here." And so it was a very happy reunion that we had. And so then I felt very connected.
Isn't it your age now, more or less?
Well, I'm 77, so next year. That's what I told him. I said, I'm 77. How could you be 78? Do the math. So the good thing was that he was a great model for me as a man, but the truth of the matter, he was an oversexed dwarf. So he was both. I don't know. So I have to get that out of my system.
Well, your books are translated into so many different languages. How closely do you work with the translators?
In the Spanish, I fight with them all the time about the language because they're tailored to the Spanish audience in Spain, and most of my readers are in South America, and they're different. But I lose the battle. I lose the battle. Like my assistant, Laura there, she knows what a gilipollas is, but not very many people who speak Spanish do know what a gilipollas. It's a bum, and that's and so they people follow me around. Gilipollas, gilipollas, gilipollas. But the other ones I don't have any. No luck. I don't even know if they translate them right.
Spanish publishers in Spain then?
In Spain, yeah. But they have often. I guess Penguin owns my publisher now. It's Bertelsmann.
Which is Random House.
It's just random, yeah.
big
Yeah,
group now.
from big.
Random
Yeah.
House, yeah.
Hey, you got to start somewhere. That's it. I don't believe it. Huh? That's easy.
And the question that you're always asked probably is collaboration with your wife on a book?
Well, I have a funny story about that. Carmen Balcells, our agent, about two and a half years ago, decided that she and I should write a mystery together. And that battle lasted about a week because she sat down. You're married to one of the famous writers in the world, and she says, "Okay, here's how it's going to be. I tell you what to write, and you write it. And I'll take charge, and I'll do this." And I said, "Look, after a week, very nerve-wracking, I said, no, this is not going to work." So then she said, "Well, I can't do this by myself because we're going to write a mystery, and I don't know anything about mysteries." And I said, "Well, you just dead body first. Has anybody read Ripper by Isabel Allende?" Well, I'll just tell you. You did read it? No? Anybody? Okay, so anyway, first page, she says and she has a dead body, but it's 9 or 10 pages, and I said, no, you can't do that. So then she comes back and she says, "How about this?" And I said, "This is better." She has a guy lying dead in a gym with a baseball bat up his ass. And I said, "Well, now that's a murder." I said, "You got it." And the only thing is, when you let Isabel Allende loose with horror, she's pretty powerful. So then we talk about every scene, and I said, "Suspense is the next thing. You can't do that. You got to do this," and because she listens to me now. And so then I read the first 50 pages, and I said, "Well, Isabel, this isn't exactly the way you write a mystery, but what the hell? You're Isabel Allende. You can do whatever the hell you want. And she did, and it's a bestseller. So, Ripper, good. It's a good book. Remember that. Heard from Willie Who.
Really, thank you so much.
Yeah, pleasure. Thank you. Yeah, yeah. Okay.
Thank you all for coming. We have Willie's books there in at least two languages.
Spanish, and Portuguese.
English,
Yeah.
Spanish, and Portuguese. So buy one of each.
Yeah, there you go.
Anyway,
And then-
thank you all for coming in.
And this
Thanks
is
so
yours.
much.
I was just borrowed it.
Thanks.
Yeah.
And he'll be here signing books as well. That's great.
Yeah.
Thanks.